Thank you for downloading the IEA podcast. You can listen to all our episodes on Podbean, Spotify, Apple, and YouTube. Enjoy. When Fidel Castro died in 2016, Jeremy Corbyn, the then leader of the Labour Party, praised the communist revolutionary who ruled Cuba for almost 50 years as a huge figure in our lives. Corbyn spoke of his heroism and the nation's impressive health and education services. It's not unusual to see politicians in Western liberal nations present Cuba as an example of how socialism can work. Bernie Sanders also gushed about Castro's education and literacy programs during the 2020 presidential election campaign. But given that another revolution is brewing in the streets of Havana, could the fallacy of successful Cuban communism, held in high esteem by those who've never experienced it, be finally coming to an end? Last month, dozens of people were arrested in Cuba after thousands joined the biggest rallies for decades against the government's mismanagement of the COVID crisis and the nation's rapidly deteriorating economy. Protesters were heard calling, "We have no fear," and "down with the dictatorship." So what's next for Cuba? With me to discuss this is Head of Political Economy at the Institute of Economic Affairs, Dr. Kristian Neiemietz. So to begin with, several Labour MPs have tweeted about their opposition to the US trade embargo, implying that that was the real source of Cuba's economic problems, not the communist regime. So to recap, the US has a long history of imposing embargoes on Cuba, obviously heightening in the 1960s with bans on the export of all goods to Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But in 2000, Bill Clinton authorized the sale of food and humanitarian products to Cuba. The Obama administration also eased restrictions in the attempt to establish diplomatic relations with the regime, also known as the Cuban Thaw. Admittedly, it was announced that President Trump had enacted new rules which would reinforce the business and travel restrictions that were loosened by the Obama administration. So, Kristian, do they have a point? What is the effect of the US embargo? Does it explain Cuba's turmoil?
No, it clearly doesn't. It is a factor, and we shouldn't deny that or downplay it. And I also think as liberals, we should be opposed to the embargo because it's, first of all, economic sanctions are a very blunt policy tool. There was an IEA report on this, I think 3 years ago, on the economics of sanctions, which showed quite convincingly, in my opinion, that sanctions have a bad track record on their own terms, that they usually don't achieve their desired aim of political change in the country that is being sanctioned. So they don't work on their own terms. And also I think even if they did, it shouldn't be the role of the US government or any other government to try to work towards regime change in another country, especially, at least not if it's a country that isn't a threat to anyone, and Cuba just isn't. I mean, no one can seriously claim that Cuba is a serious threat on a geopolitical level. So therefore, I think those sanctions are firstly illegitimate, and even if there were a legitimate case for them, they would probably be very ineffective anyway. So while we should oppose them, we should also make clear that it just cannot logically be the reason why Cuba is poor. And the reason for that is that, firstly, people who criticize the sanctions, people who support the Cuban regime, often refer to that embargo as a blockade, the Cuba blockade. And they call it that because that's the way Fidel Castro used to call it, and they just copied that from him. But it isn't a blockade. An embargo and a blockade, those are two very different things. An embargo would be like, let's say, if I refused to come on your podcast, that would be an embargo. That would be the Niemietz podcast embargo. But that would mean you could still record your podcast, just not with me. but you can record it with anyone else in the world. That would be an embargo. A blockade would be if I tried to stop other people from coming onto your podcast. If I stood in front of the podcast studio with a baseball bat and said, no one is getting in here, that would be a blockade. That's a completely different thing. When you call it a blockade, you make it sound as if the US had gunboats around Cuba that tried to stop cargo vessels, or as if they had something like what happened during the World Wars when with German submarines trying to attack cargo ships that try to reach Britain, and the other way around. But it's nothing like that. The embargo in this case just means that Cuba cannot trade extensively with the US, but they can trade with literally any other country in the world. They can trade with, for example, Canada or with Mexico, and there are large economies in that region, and Cuba is absolutely not prevented by the embargo from trading with them. But Cuba doesn't do that to a large extent. Cuba doesn't trade very much with anyone. I can't remember the exact figures, but I remember looking them up, the trade statistics for Cuba when I wrote the socialism book 2 years ago or so, and they show that imports and exports are a very small proportion of Cuba's overall economy, and the embargo cannot explain that. The embargo can result in a diversion of trade. They could explain why Cuba would trade far too much with Canada or far too much with Mexico when they should really be trading with the US, because that would be their natural market. If that were the case, then you could say, okay, this is clearly the effect of the embargo, that you get an inefficient trade pattern. They try to compensate for the lack of trade with the US by trading far too much with economies that are not their natural trading partner. If it was something like that, then you could say, right, this has to be the embargo in action. But that isn't what you observe. They don't trade very much with Canada. They don't trade very much with Mexico. In fact, their main trading partner has always been an ideological ally. It used to be the Soviet Union historically. It's now Venezuela. And that shows you something about the nature of Cuban trade policy, that it's highly politicized, and that is what you would expect in a socialist economy. Because if you wanted to trade with Cuba, as let's say you owned a company and you wanted to export something to Cuba, how would you do that in practice? It wouldn't be like trading with a market economy where you try to get your goods and services to the consumers there. In the case of Cuba, it would have to go through some government entity, because it's a socialist economy and everything goes through a government entity. And that means it's a political decision. And I just cannot imagine that even if the US revoked the embargo completely overnight today, I just cannot imagine that Cuban authorities would be that keen on high volumes of trade with a country that they see as an enemy. So it's in that regard, the embargo must be largely ineffective. They wouldn't trade much with the US in any case.
Absolutely, and talking about the reliance on the USSR, I mean the effects of having trade based on ideological partners was devastating. So after in 1990, when the USSR collapsed, there was major riots all over Cuba because there was massive food shortages because they relied so heavily on Russian imports. I think Cubans saw their daily intake of calories fall from 2,600 in the 1980s a day to between 1,000 and 1,500 in 1993. So, these are, like you said, they are a political choice to simply engage with trade with fellow communist regimes. But let's move on then to Cuba and the left in this country. So by putting all the blame on the embargo, as some have done, they're refusing to condemn the Cuban regime. Are those MPs effectively siding with the communist regime? But most importantly, are these MPs outliers? or are they quite representative of left-wing opinion both here and, say, in America?
Yeah, it's a mixed bag. First of all, on the first question, yes, I think they absolutely do. If you only talk about the embargo and you don't side with the protesters, or you don't criticize the regime as well, then yes, you are siding with them in effect, because you are implying that that trade embargo is the only reason why there are problems, when it isn't. I mean, the embargo, even if it had a bigger economic effect than I think it has, that would still not explain why the Cuban state is clamping down violently on protesters and why they arrest political opponents. The embargo could, in theory, make the country poorer, but it cannot force the regime to become repressive against its will. So it's just silly to reduce the conflict to that, which is what people who only tweet about the embargo are in effect doing. I think the people on the left who struck the right tone, somewhat to my surprise, were Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, because both of them tweeted about this. They started by siding with the protesters, saying something in support of the protesters. They also then mentioned the embargo, and fair enough, it's fine to mention that, but you shouldn't start your statement with that, and that shouldn't be the only thing, because if you do that, that is, I'd say that's a cowardly option. That's a way of the MPs, the British MPs who have done that, are taking an easy route. They want to say something clearly in defense of the Cuban regime, but they don't quite have the guts to do that, because if you did that, you would be criticized. That would be, at least in some circles, a controversial statement. So they don't want to literally say, yes, I support the Cuban regime. The Cuban Communist Party are the good guys. And so instead they go for this weaselly roundabout way of talking about the embargo is, and how the US are the real baddies, because that's the cheap option. You know that will get you applause. That's going to be the sort of thing that your left-wing fans want to hear, and you're going to get lots of likes and retweets for that. And but if somebody then criticized you and said you're a pro-regime voice, you have the plausible deniability. You could say, no, I didn't say anything about the regime. And but that's exactly the problem. You should say something about it. And it's also, I mean, if an American politician criticizes the embargo, that's one thing, because it is an American embargo. It's their policy. And if they had a vote on this matter, then those American politicians would be among the people voting on it. So it's fine for American politicians to talk about the embargo. But if you're a British MP, come on, what does this have to do with you? There are no British sanctions on Cuba. I mean, you can trade legally with Cuba as much as you want. Well, you would run into the problem that I described before. On the Cuban side, there would be a problem, because the regime would probably not be too happy about that. And as I said, all trade would have to go through some government agency. But there's no, from the British side, there's no legal restrictions there. And therefore, why do British politicians feel obliged to make a big fuss about that at all? Who is their opponent? Who are they arguing against here? Because in Britain, I've never met anyone here who is in favor of the embargo. So it's always a bit cowardly when people act as if they were bravely taking a stand and are really saying something that has no opponents. If you lived in Florida, where there is a lot of support for the embargo, because there's a lot of Miami Cubans who hate the Cuban regime and who would see that a reversal of the embargo as a way of going soft on Cuba, there it would be controversial. There, if you live in Florida and you speak out against it, okay, that's one thing, because there at least you have an opponent. It would be clear whom you are addressing. But if you do it in Britain, what's the point? Who are you trying to convince? there is no British embargo on Cuba. There is, as far as I know, nobody who supports it anyway. So you just don't have an opponent, and that makes it empty virtue signaling to go on about the embargo.
Do you think then that, you know, this soft sort of get out of jail free card, yeah, we support the protesters, but we also dislike the US embargoes you've talked about, you know, is that, do all politicians of all stripes need to be a bit harsher? Because the Castro's communist state has committed terrible atrocities, you know, between 1959 and 1970. Historian Hugh Thomas, he estimated that 5,000 political prisoners had been executed by firing squads. You know, there's testimonies of Cuban prisoners in the 1980s who exposed that the regime had practiced torture and biological experiments on inmates in hard labor camps. You know, all these egregious acts, you know, human rights abuses, have sort of escaped the minds of many people. Do you think we need to be a lot harsher on the Cuban regime?
We certainly go relatively soft on them. They get away with a lot which other regimes would not get away with. Although we have to be clear here, it's not the left as a whole, or even the socialist left as a whole. There are other voices. I've mentioned Bernie Sanders. He has been clear about this, or as clear as he can realistically get. And in Britain, it's the British socialist left seems to have a strange on-off relationship with Cuba. I remember when a few years ago, when Castro died, Owen Jones wrote an article in which he quite clearly distanced himself from Cuba. He even said Cuba isn't socialist. He even disputed the socialist credentials. He said Cuba, or he said socialism means democratizing the economy. A socialist economy is an economy that's run democratically. The workers own the means of production, and that clearly isn't what Cuba is. You have an elite. Now, I'm obviously not a fan of that sort of reasoning, because that's the whole real socialism has never been tried logic. But at least he made clear that he was not prepared to defend that regime. So that's one thing. But you also see the complete opposite, and from people who are ideologically very much in the same ballpark as Owen Jones. For example, there's Helen Jaffe, who is a professor at some Scottish university, who wrote for The Guardian this week and for Novara Media, I think last week, a piece or two articles in which she very clearly took sided with the regime. She was saying that these protests are just manufactured from the outside. She was talking about influencers in Miami who are trying to instigate protests or trying to whip them up. So very much making it sound as if these protesters were all just foreign-funded stooges, CIA-funded stooges. And this is something that socialists have long been doing. This has a long tradition. This was a thing when in the 50s, when there was the uprising in East Germany, the uprising against the Socialist Unity Party. There were several British MPs at the time who said these are terrorist groups. These protesters, they are funded either, well, whichever you want to insert. Some said it's CIA, some said it's some West German neo-Nazi group, coming up with all these conspiracy theories because they just couldn't comprehend that there would be uprisings, popular uprisings in a socialist state, because in their mythology, socialism means ruled by the people, ruled by the working class. So logically, the workers can't protest against themselves. Workers can't protest against a worker state, and that's very much the logic that this Guardian article and the Novara article was making. And if this was in some fringe publication, and say the Socialist Worker, okay, I'd say it's not worth mentioning it. But the Guardian is very much a mainstream publication, and I would say Novara is absolutely too. I mean, they like to pose as countercultural, but nowadays nothing could be more fashionable than being a socialist. So there's nothing countercultural about them. They're very much a mainstream medium, and they do publish these articles that regurgitate propaganda from the Cuban regime, and so that is very much a thing on the British left. It's not universal. There are other voices, but it is a substantial, significant minority. There is, of course, Jeremy Corbyn himself, who is still effectively the leader of the socialist left in Britain. He has long been a fan of the Cuban regime. He's been at this for decades. I remember reading something by him from the early 90s in the Morning Star, where he took aim at British leftists who were critical of Cuba. He said this isn't helpful. They're doing their best, and leave them alone. They're trying. Those words that they're trying to build the best kind of socialism they can. And just the other week, he has been retweeting an article by the Cuba Solidarity Campaign, which again made this claim that these protests are all just foreign funded, foreign manipulated infiltrators. So trying to say that there is no real unrest in Cuba. The people absolutely love the regime, and that mythology is just a few troublemakers who are being stirred up by these shadowy entities from Miami or wherever you want to locate them in your imagination, and engaging in all this conspiracy stuff. And Corbyn was retweeting that, and McDonnell also a few years ago, when he was still Shadow Chancellor, he also said that a British government led by him would be the staunchest ally of the Cuban Revolution. So there is all that. It's quite widespread on the socialist left in Britain. Yes.
So virtually nobody, including on the left, supports, for example, other communist regimes like North Korea. And you have alluded to it a bit in the past, but specifically, why does supporting the Cuban dictatorship seem to be more socially acceptable? What explains that inconsistency?
Yeah, there we can only speculate, but I guess a big part of the reason is that it always depends on the comparison group. In North Korea, we can obviously see that is a terrible regime because we just compare it to South Korea. South Korea is a prosperous democracy. So there it's really not much of a competition. Before that was the case, in the 70s, there were also quite a few North Korea fans. That was when South Korea was also still poor and was also a military dictatorship. It wasn't so clear which of the two Koreas was the better place. As long as the jury was still out, as long as that was the situation, there were North Korea fans as well. And in the case of Cuba, it's just less clear what a Cuba without the revolution, if that had never happened, it's not so clear what Cuba would be like today. We don't have such a clear and obvious counterfactual. And I think that's part of the story, that at least throughout much of the 20th century, post-war history, until about 30 years ago, most Latin Americans lived under a dictatorship of some sort. Mostly this would have been military dictatorships, and in most of those countries, you also had very high poverty rates and economic underdevelopment. So there was nothing uniquely bad about Cuba. You could say it was yes, a poor country. Yes, an autocratic country with human rights violations, but it was located in a region of the world where that was the norm. So it's not that that you had all these thriving democracies around it, and Cuba as this poor, repressive, backward hellhole. No, it was varying degrees of underdevelopment, varying degrees of repression, and there was nothing uniquely bad about Cuba. So that could explain why, even as the enthusiasm for the Cuban Revolution faded because of refugees from there trying to get away from it, the early romanticism couldn't be sustained, but it never turned completely sour. And that is a massive difference between Cuba and North Korea. Nowadays, it isn't quite like that anymore. Nowadays, most Latin American countries are actually middle-income countries. Most of them are democracies. They may not be success stories. There may not be a lot of models that we would admire, so socioeconomic models that we would admire, but they're certainly not hellholes. And in that regard, we maybe have to update our perceptions a bit, that we still think of the poor, underdeveloped backyard of the United States, and it really isn't like that anymore. There are some relatively prosperous economies in that part of the world now. And if we compare Cuba to modern Latin American, Caribbean counterparts, then the Cuban reality looks pretty grim. But I guess we aren't really doing that. We are still thinking of the military caudillo figure of the 20th century, the military strongman running a poor, underdeveloped country. That is still a perception of Latin America, and in that comparison, Cuba isn't so bad. I've also seen people compare Cuba to some of its nearest neighbors, to Haiti, and say, well, Cuba is certainly, even if it's not a success story, even if it's not massively prosperous, clearly they're doing better than them. But I'd say that's a massive mistake, because Cuba was already relatively highly developed in the 50s, and therefore whatever would have happened without the Castro revolution, it would never have been a case like Haiti. It would probably have been much more like Puerto Rico, which is the richest part of Latin America and the Caribbean. And okay, not a perfect comparison, because that's not a sovereign country. That's an overseas territory of the United States. But for economic comparisons, that shouldn't matter. That doesn't mean that you can't compare them. That just means that their economic policy is very much aligned with that of the US. So if you want to know what Cuba might be like if they had US type economic policies, well, then Puerto Rico is the place you might want to look at. And their living standards are not that far behind some of the poorer parts of the US. So if you ranked the states of the US, if Puerto Rico were a fully incorporated state of the US, then they would be the poorest, yes, but not by a large margin. It would just be a continuation. You have the very prosperous, the Californias and New Yorks at the top. You have some of the southern states less prosperous, and Puerto Rico is just a bit below that, but still being one of the poorest states of the US means you would still be richer than a lot of European countries. You would still be certainly richer than Greece or Portugal. And that is where Cuba could be today. Yes, I think that's a more realistic counterfactual, but somehow we're not comparing them in those terms.
But just to play devil's advocate here, supporters of the regime point out, that Cuba, despite its problems, it has had some achievements, surely, since, especially in the social sphere. So universal literacy, average life expectancy is 79 years, so maybe the system isn't that bad after all. And, would a return to a capitalist economy put those achievements at risk? What do you say to that?
I would first of all say that that's true. On some social indicators, Cuba is indeed doing pretty well, certainly relative to its level of economic development. But I'd also point out that that was already the case before the revolution. Cuba was already quite highly developed before the revolution in the 50s. They were doing quite well on social indicators. They had a literacy rate of something like 80%, so 4 out of 5 adults being able to read and write, which nowadays doesn't sound impressive, but in the 50s and for that part of the world, that would have been impressive. And life expectancy, infant mortality, those sort of indicators, they were well ahead of their neighbors already in the 50s, already before the revolution. There were positive trends happening before, and they just more or less continued after the revolution. So you can credit them for not stopping those positive trends or for not reversing them, but you can't claim that, let's say, the entire difference in life expectancy between Cuba and Haiti is somehow due to socialism. They would, under no circumstances, in no possible universe, would they ever have been like Haiti. They were far more developed before the revolution and continued after that. And if they return to capitalism today, I can't see why that would change. You can, of course, have universal healthcare in capitalist economies. In fact, almost all capitalist economies do that. Some in more market-oriented ways, some in more statist ways. Britain is unfortunately at the more statist end. That's not the way I would want to do it. But you can certainly have universal healthcare in market economies. In fact, almost all market economies have that, and I can't see why a capitalist Cuba would put that at risk, especially if their healthcare system is popular, or at least if that universality aspect of their healthcare system is popular, then why would a democratic government want to change that? There might be whatever the emergence of a private healthcare sector. Alongside that, you might get healthcare providers that offer higher levels of comfort, and you might be less egalitarian. You could have that maybe if they return to a market economy, but why would they want to endanger the universality or the quality of their healthcare provision? If that's one of the good aspects of the system, then they would absolutely keep that if they return to a market economy.
I mean, just to touch on what you said at the very beginning, talking about the comparison between before the revolution and after. If we look at the Human Development Index, which uses life expectancy, education, and per capita income as indicators to rank countries, so Cuba, a nation of 11 million, ranks 12 places lower than the neighboring island of the Bahamas and 11 places below Barbados, which each have a population under 500,000. But it used to be ranked 5th in the hemisphere in per capita income, 3rd in life expectancy, 2nd in per capita ownership of stuff like automobiles and telephones, all before the revolution. So you're right to say that Cuba has suffered a miserable decline. What do you think will happen next in Cuba? So obviously we started the discussion talking about recent events, protests on the streets over medicine and food shortages, curbs of free speech. Should the US and the UK support the democracy activists, and how should they do that? Or do we need to confront our own apologists for Castro's revolution at home before we get involved?
I think we absolutely should, and I think that is the best thing we can do. I wouldn't support any foreign policy interventions, but it would certainly help to highlight the voices of the Cuban opposition, and because this is a regime which is not entirely immune to international pressure, to reputational pressure, even if there is no formal policy, but it's not that they are completely indifferent to how they are seen at the world stage. And it would be great if we could highlight the voices of the Cuban opposition, and maybe that is going to happen now with the internet arriving there. I mean, that's one of the things that until quite recently, until just a few years ago, the internet wasn't really a thing in Cuba. They are like 2 decades behind us on that measure. So for them, and even now, most Cubans don't have internet access. But now it's reached a stage where they have something like 40% or so of the population with internet access, and that's already a massive improvement compared to a few years ago, when hardly anyone had it. That could be a game changer, and in that way they could insert themselves into global debates on this issue. I think it would be quite entertaining if we could see, for example, Twitter fights between Western socialists, people who embrace socialism because they think it makes them look cool and edgy, which is the reason, of course, why most Western socialists are socialists in the first place. It's mostly a fashion statement. Imagine a confrontation between some of those edgy Western socialists against Cubans who actually live under that system, and something like that could be quite an eye-opener for some people, which is why I hope that is going to happen. But so far, that's not a thing yet. They haven't reached that stage yet. Cubans are not really part of the global digital community, if you want to call it that. You probably don't have any Cuban Twitter followers, say, because they would just be they would just be discovering that now, relatively recently for them. This is all a recent thing. Until a couple of years ago, as I said, hardly anyone had internet access, but it's becoming a thing now, and maybe we will see more Cuban voices in those discussions.
Kristian, that's all we got time for. But thank you to Dr. Kristian Niemietz for his valuable insight. We hope you will join us again soon. Thank you for listening. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the IEA podcast on Podbean, Spotify or Apple. We also upload our podcast on our YouTube channel, IEA London. If you want to help contribute to the IEA's digital output, please support us on Patreon, where you can benefit from exclusive membership perks whilst helping us continue to produce stimulating educational output. To become an online patron, click the link in the show notes.